Okay, so my students say that I talk very fast, so I'm going to try and talk even faster for this group because I only have 10 minutes. So as I teach at Berkeley, I teach in a bunch of different areas in Berkeley. I also work with a lot of different companies and tech and finance companies. There's some companies I've worked with. And one of the most fundamental questions in economics, something that we're really obsessed with, is how do we organize economic activity, right? How do we take this activity and move it inside firm boundaries, or how do we do it across firm boundaries? In other words, the size and the shape of the firm. There's a whole area of economics around that. Sometimes it's called institutional economics, theory of the firm, transaction cost economics, and it was sort of founded by this guy, this Nobel laureate, Ronald Coase. And so the question then is, right, and when we organize economic activity, we're going to trade off the cost of doing this economic activity in-house, right, inside firm boundaries, versus doing it across firm boundaries. And if we do it across firm boundaries, it's got to come in some form of contract. And really, it fundamentally boils down to, is there a trust relationship? Can we trust or rely on the promises that are made by the different parties? And are we going to find these promises to be more reliable when we're dealing inside firm boundaries versus outside firm boundaries? And so, of course, any economist is going to tell you that it's all about trade-offs, and so there's actually a way of formalizing these trade-offs. But another way to think about it, because I'm also a lawyer, is, do we rely on arm's-length contracts between anonymous people, right, who may be interacting once or maybe interacting multiple times, or do we rely on what are sometimes called relational contracts, or built on trust without any kind of formal legal enforcement mechanism? So a family firm is an example, because the way in which we trust one another is really, I can punish you by not having you over to dinner, if you breach your promises or so forth. Okay, so when we rely on arm's length contracts, really all we're doing is we're putting together a bunch of reliable if-then provisions, right? If you deliver the goods, I will pay you. If you deliver late, I'll pay you late. I'll pay you more or pay you less or whatever. You write out all of these different conditions, and then you put it into some kind of document, and then you hope that you can enforce it in some way. Now, the problem is that there are a lot of regimes and a lot of places in the world and a lot of times in human history where it's extremely difficult to enforce these legal contracts, either because we lack the court system, or because we lack the lawyers, right? So when we look at the number of lawyers out there in the world, the US has tons of lawyers. Other countries like China have virtually no lawyers. And I would say that most Middle East countries are going to be on the left side of this diagram. Okay, and without lawyers, it's going to be very difficult to create some kind of legally enforceable contracts, right? So Israel actually has the highest number of lawyers per capita, which makes it an anomaly in the region. Now, furthermore, even if you have lawyers and you take somebody to court, okay, will you actually be able to enforce the contract? So, India has on paper a legal system which looks almost identical to that of England with respect to contract law. But if you try to sue somebody in India, good luck with that, right? You'll be in court for like 50 years or 100 years, right, waiting for your court case to get before a judge. So it doesn't matter what's written on paper. What matters is, do you have this legal infrastructure or architecture? So a lot of people, Maria was talking about the grabbing hand and so forth. A lot of public policy people have focused on, okay, in order to have these arm's length contracts, we're going to have to invest a ton of money in building out legal system, courts and lawyers. And that's a huge project. And I am actually very pessimistic about that project, even though I'm a lawyer. And so, what we want to find are some workarounds. How do we work around this? And I think technology is going to help us a lot. So, if you don't have good workable court systems and good workable arm's length contract enforcement systems, then you're going to rely on these kind of extended firms. So in Japan, in Korea, you have Karetsos, you have chaebols, you have these other kinds of, interlocking networks, right? If you look at the Middle East, right, you have a lot of these family firms. This is a classic example, right? The Al Ghurair Group. What do? They do food, they do retail, they do property, they do education, right? You look at this as a business professor, you're like, what's their core competency? Well, their core competency is that they can all trust one another. Okay? If you had arm's length contracts, you'd never see a company that looks like that. So there's a third option in addition to kind of family firms and arm's length contracts that rely on a court system, and that is self-enforcing contracts, right? Contracts that use technology rather than the legal system to enforce these promises. Now, this goes back a long way, right? I'm not talking about technology like computer code, although that's what we will be talking about. In the Middle Ages, they had contract enforcement technology called hostages. right? So, if I say, hey, I promise I won't break the truce, I promise I won't invade your country. So there's actually a famous example. I think the Crown Prince of Portugal was in Morocco. He invaded, and then he got surrounded by the Moroccans, and they're about to kill all the Portuguese. And the Portuguese said, oh, let us go. We promise we won't come back ever again. And so the Portuguese Crown Prince said, here, you can take my brother. If I reinvade, you can kill my brother, okay? Now, that's a technology of enforcement. And, it works when it works. And sometimes, so in the case of the Portuguese Crown Prince, he came back the next year. They killed the Crown Prince, and, it was two birds with one stone from the perspective of the Crown Prince. Okay, so, there's weaknesses to this technology. But a self-enforcing contract, you can think of this, right? If you have two people and they put some money in a box and they say, hey, I won't withdraw the money without your permission, you don't withdraw the money without my permission. Well, you can put that on a piece of paper, or you can create two keys, and using physics, right, using the lock mechanism, using technology, you can make it so that that promise will be self-enforcing. Okay, and there's a famous example in the Disney movies of the pirates who, put the treasure and they bury it and they put on a map and they rip the map in half. Okay, again, this is enforcement technology that doesn't rely on the courts. So we see this happening all throughout business. So think about Microsoft. They released Microsoft Vista back in 2004, okay? And, they have copyright protection that you're supposedly supposed to pay to use it, right? And you're not supposed to copy it because that's against the law. How many copies do you think they sold in China? You got 1 billion people with PCs. How many of them bought Windows Vista? 244. Okay? So, what you could do if you're Microsoft is you could, invest a lot of money, try to convince the Chinese to respect intellectual property, try to set up courts and get lawyers and all that stuff. But, that's not going to be cost effective. So there's a much better way to do this. It's called, right, cloud computing, right? So now, we don't rely on the courts. We rely on technology. If you don't pay the licensing fee, you lose access. Okay, so technology can be used as a substitute for the courts. And so this is an idea that was formulated by a number of people, but this guy, Nick Szabo, who's now kind of famous for writing this article on smart contracts, and he said, a smart contract's like a vending machine. When you go to a vending machine, you put the money in and the food comes out, right? There's no lawyer present, okay, to kind of enforce that deal. If the code is written correctly, if the mechanism of the machinery is functioning well, then that if-then proposition gets executed automatically. Coins go in, goods come out. Okay, so another example of this might be, when you get a security interest in a car, right? You finance the purchase of a car, and that person fails to make a payment. What does the bank do? The bank has to go and, collect the car, right? They have to chase down the owner. They have to break into their garage, maybe shoot the dog, and then drive off with the car. And they have to get a warrant from the sheriff, and it's a very, very expensive machinery. The other alternative would be just to put some software in the car, so that if the payment is missed, boom, car doesn't work, okay? You have an ignition lock. No courts, right? No judges, no sheriffs, no repo men, no dogs getting killed, right? You just shut off access to the car, okay? So this is software, this is technology, and it's a way of bypassing the legal system when the legal system is not working for you, okay? It's too expensive to use. Now, we have lots and lots of these vending machines in the financial system, in the more developed financial system. My background is in finance, and a special purpose vehicle, which is a way of financing lots of different things, from credit cards to mortgages to infrastructure. Okay, these things are like vending machines. Cash comes in, cash goes out according to a formula. Okay, and it's automatic, and it's meant to be automatic. The whole purpose of it is automatic, and you have this complex machinery to make it all possible, okay? And it's built on, the security interest in all the different property and so forth. And when it comes to, in the Western world, if you want to identify whether or not there is security interest in a piece of property, you have to run a search, okay? You file the security, then you have to run a search and so forth, okay? But when you go to other countries like India, okay, this is how you find out who owns what, right? You walk down to this office, okay, and, you try to make sense of it. Okay, so, are there ways to get around this primitive legal system, which really isn't going to change anytime soon? Well, you can use technology, and so a lot of people are investing in technological workarounds to try and figure out how to design systems that allow for contractual enforcement without without law. So all those SPVs I mentioned, all the swap contracts, all the financial contracts that we have in the Western world are built on these dumb contracts, right? Natural language contracts. These natural language contracts we are now potentially replacing with code, right? And code is nothing more than a series of if-thens, right? So if this data comes in, this data goes out. And so if you have a smart contract like this, okay, of course you still have law going on in the background, but you have self-executing, right, agreements. So if a payment is made, then a payment goes out. If goods arrive, then the payment gets made, okay? And so the applications, I think, are huge. And what we're seeing is that software is eating the world. We know that it's taking over almost every aspect of business, and I want to suggest that it's taking over law as well. And the lawyers in the Western world are being replaced by robots, but in the developing world, right, it's not that the lawyers will be replaced by the robots, but the lawyers that don't exist, right, will be substituted by software and technology. And so there's enormous opportunity, I think, here for us in Silicon Valley, for people who understand technology, to get into the business of providing legal infrastructure for people out there in a world where the legal infrastructure is weak. The application I'm working on a lot has to do with supply chain, right? And taking, whether you're doing logistics, whether you're doing manufacturing, whether you're doing construction, there are so many contracts and agreements that take place across all of these different participants. And you either have to put them all under one roof, or you have to find some kind of good quality legal system, or now we have a third possibility, which is you can use software, right, to govern these relationships, okay? And so that's how I see the world changing, and I see us as being in a position to really provide this infrastructure to emerging markets that will enable emerging markets to leapfrog, potentially, even over the legal infrastructure that we have here in the West. So thank you very much for having me here. Happy to discuss in other times.